Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today for the last session on day one of the Future of Private Investing Festival, which is on the topic investing in people and exploring the S in ESG rather. My name's Alex Newman, an associate editor at the Investors Chronicle, and I'll be hosting today's event, which I'm grateful to say is sponsored by Civitas Social Housing. I'll introduce our group of panelists and jump into our discussion in just a moment. But before I do that, just a quick few bits of housekeeping. We've already had a few questions submitted to our experts, but if you want to ask them a question, you can still do that in the box marked Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll aim to weave some of them into the discussion as we go along. Second, I'm told a recording of this webinar will be available later today after the event has finished, and then on demand for 30 days. So that'll be accessible through the same link you used. And you will have plenty of time to listen back to the discussion at your leisure. Other useful links, resources, and the feedback link can also be found above. Okay, so in the blurb for today's session, it alludes to the fact that ESG, obviously the buzzword of markets for the last couple of years, ends up being a slightly lazy byword for investments that focus on environmental outcomes, and that the S bit representing social investing remains distinctly underexplored. So in this session, we're going to try and define investments with social impact, how this field has evolved in the last couple of years, the risks and rewards involved, and whether social impact investing can provide a steady source of returns. But before we jump into the discussion, can I just start by introducing our panelists? So in no particular order, we have Paul Bridge, Chief Executive Officer of the Social Housing at Civitas Investment Management, which manages the listed social housing landlord Civitas Social Housing. We've got Andrew Wordsworth, co-founder and director of Sustainable Ventures, a venture capital firm which works with and invests in early stage sustainable companies to scale up. And last but not least, Susanna Coutinho, research director at Main Street Partners, an investment advisory group, which has been providing analytics on ESG, sustainable and impact investing since 2008. Thank you all so much for joining me today for our session. I know it's the end of the day. But lots to talk about. So if I could maybe start with you, Andrew, the history of markets and capitalism has largely been about making money. The knock-on effects on what doing that means for society is often historically been an irrelevance. So why should investors care about socially minded investing?
So here at Sustainable Ventures, we believe in the power of commercial innovation to unlock the challenge of climate change and other wider sustainability issues.
So when we met hundreds of investors 6 years ago to raise equity to invest into social housing, what became clear to us is that there's clearly a generational change happening to the extent that I think there are a number of very large institutions and smaller ones, pension funds, who want to obviously generate responsible returns, matching their dividend requirements at the same time as doing good. Now we can obviously discuss what doing good might mean, and we might have different views on it. But if one considers that clearly we have a society in the West where there are a number of vulnerable people who do require lots of capital and revenue support. And we particularly support people who have long-term limiting care needs of working age. And you wouldn't want to house them anywhere else because actually the alternatives are hospital and the social outcomes are very poor for people, but also the costs are actually very high. And when we look at this, what do we mean by it? Well, in terms of investors, clearly we can say, well, we've got a portfolio that performs well environmentally, we've got a portfolio that caters for people across the country, but in terms of looking at the S, you're really saying, okay, well, what are the numbers, but also how do people feel about these investments? And I think our experience as investors are very excited by that, because obviously, it's a win-win, isn't it? If you can invest money, get a reasonable and sensible return, and also help others, to me, that's a bit of a no-brainer.
Sure. Okay. So maybe could I put a slightly different question to you now? And thanks to Paul for your answer there. I mean, you see lots of fund manager and company claims around social impact. I mean, obviously, Paul's in the social housing sector, but it ranges, doesn't it, from giving charities cheap finance to access to credit or housing. What for you, when we talk about social impact, should be the priorities?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously a lot of reports around people making sort of false ESG claims. I think ultimately for us, it comes down to the evidence of the consumer demographic, particularly amongst young people, is really moving towards looking for authentic social impact products, goods and services. So companies that can deliver those and genuinely deliver them will face a growing market. Companies that can't do that, whilst they can get through the next couple of years by putting the spin around it, ultimately that those goods and services will not have a viable future. And therefore, we see that is driving our belief and our investment philosophy in terms of we don't believe that delivering a social good compromises financial returns. In fact, it enhances them because over the long term, particularly around sort of outside of the sort of net zero agenda, but equally on the social impact side, those companies that are genuinely delivering social impact will have a long-term market because that's where the future consumer lies.
Absolutely, it's a really interesting point. That, and I suppose on the almost consumption-led demand for in some sectors where social impact and consumption goes hand in hand. Susanna, I mean, you look at the real nitty-gritty, don't you, of what social impact ends up being almost in a quantitative sense when you're looking at companies. I mean, every company annual report now will have a chapter on its social impact. I mean, some of the conversations we've had this year, I mean, defense companies providing weapons that allow a democracy to fight off an invading force qualifies as a social good. Diageo makes drinks that people enjoy. Coal companies produce an energy source that allows economic development in South Africa. How do you sort of cut through that PR piece and really identify that the social impact is positive or negative?
That's a great question. Social issues are typically very controversial because it's not so quantifiable as metrics related to climate. So it's very difficult to assess the qualitative aspect. So how good a company is in terms of social issues. And I would distinguish two aspects. One, really every company should do in terms of social aspects, social indicators, social criteria that they can meet, no matter what area, whether it's a defense company or a drinks, as you were explaining before. Another aspect is the social impact investing and the theme, whether you want to invest in a specific area, you want to invest in social aspects, social issues, social housing, or education. So that's a very thematic investing. There are two dimensions, and I would like to distinguish both cases. You can do good, you can measure the impact whenever, no matter what sector you are investing. So you mentioned defense, which is clearly controversial, but I would go a little bit beyond. You could invest in education, but we want to do it right. We want to invest in education companies that have good KPIs that cause a higher impact. So you can actually, even if it's a good sector, education, you can actually select companies by scrutinizing all the KPIs that they provide. And you were mentioning reports, annual reports. Now we have more access to this type of information. You could also have good education. Well, education companies, not necessarily good, because perhaps they were exaggerating their metrics. So we want to be able to filter out within a sector, whether it's good or bad, or social or not social. We want to distinguish the goods and the bads.
Yeah, I suppose you don't get a free pass just for being in a certain sector. Andrew, I think we've spoken a little bit when we've spoken before about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how they can almost work as a proxy for some of these KPIs that Susanna is talking about. In layman's terms, how does that work? What should a retail investor, for example, be looking for in trying to marry some of those SDGs to a positive social impact?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the ESGs is I think there are sort of 169 sort of subcategories, and that gets really confusing. So we try and take a slightly simpler approach when we're sort of looking at companies, and for example, sort of tackling poverty, you can get down to quite a lot. What do we mean by poverty? But if you take one of our investments called AirX, smart air brick, whilst it's primarily designed to save energy, the fact it's tackling fuel poverty by saving bills, actually you can get quite quickly, you can say, actually, this is contributing towards, eliminating poverty. It's also improving indoor air quality, which is improving health. So it's fairly, sometimes, it's very easy to get bogged down in the weeds, and I'm aware there's a huge number of people get really complicated, but ultimately you instinctively know that a company what impact it could have, and then it's a question of looking at what impact it actually does have. And companies, we talk about different sectors, companies have choices about what they do, and they can still sell the same product, but how they behave towards their staff, how they behave towards their suppliers, those are the things that come through. And so it's very, to my mind, it's quite obvious. That you can make the instinctive feeling that you can see what a company is actually doing, going beyond the sector normal.
For sure. Paul, I mean, there is the very high level there, isn't there? The UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also social impact is, positive social impact is often traditionally thought of as a responsibility of the state. Is there something to impact investing that is either best thought of as where the state has failed, or should investors, to put it differently, maybe should they have greater reassurance that socially beneficial activity will receive either implicit or explicit government state support?
I mean, that's a brilliant question, Alex, and it absolutely kind of underpins the analysis around social housing. So if you look at the UK, there's 5 million people waiting for social homes. I mean, clearly that includes children, and clearly that's a demand that will never be met, but there are probably 500,000 people who are more vulnerable, and actually some people would say, well, why doesn't the state address that straight away? And the truth of it is, when I've worked in local authorities and housing associations and charities and in the private sector, and I have a very passionate belief that you have to harness the best of all of those areas, because there is expertise in all of those areas. The state kind of, whether one believes in private capital in public spaces or not, the truth is that private capital has played an amazing part, for example, in care. 97% of all mental health care in the UK is carried out by private organisations, and it has been for the last 30 years. So I think it's about a partnership, and it's easy to use the word partnership. I think it's interesting as well to think about leverage. So you could argue that, going back to the defence versus education debate, you could argue, well, of course, a house is going to be a good thing, but actually, what else are you doing around? I mean, clearly the environment in which the house is located, the community in which it's located, but local is everything. So do you understand what is needed? For example, in an area we were working with in the Midlands during the pandemic, we have a number of properties there for people who are recovering from drug and alcohol problems. And actually, because of the pandemic, their ability to access food was much more limited. And there's a local charity called Little Sprouts, which is tiny, which we work with. And we found out about them. And that's not to say that that was something wonderful to do, but you've got to go and find out what's going on, what support is needed, and how, as a fund, you can provide leverage around it all. Because of course, if you invest and help a small charity, you have an incredible impact in a local area compared to investing in a very large charity that might, frankly, already have the resources they need. So it's just that type of intelligent thinking, I think, which isn't about replacing the state. It's about adding to what good can be done within the state.
Yeah, Susanna, it's an interesting point Paul makes there. I suppose maybe almost to broaden out the question of scale of impact. Would you say the opportunities are greatest where companies potentially have the most reform is needed within a company or sector, i.e. they are lagging on the S in ESG at the moment, and the efforts that they could make to improve their social impact actually make it in a way a more attractive investment than companies which are already delivering a kind of social good.
Mm-hmm. Well, the potential is there for all companies. You can always improve your performance and your delivery in terms of social aspects, no matter what sector you are in. Of course, some sectors are more suitable to be more in touch with communities and be able to deliver that link from what you do and where you do it. So, of course, companies that are more involved in let's give another example, perhaps healthcare. They're more in touch with population, with the patients. Companies delivering food, perhaps they could have that angle. There is this ability to improve your delivery according to what sector you are in. But again, if you go back and think about the company itself, how you engage with your stakeholders, basically all companies can do better. They could do better in social metrics that can be related to their own employees. They could potentially increase the education and the technical aspects of their own workforce. They could provide more benefits. So there are other aspects. Not what I mean is your company can do so many things that is not only via products, via what you deliver to local communities. It's actually how you perform, how you conduct your business that could have a positive impact on the community you operate in terms of diversity, in terms of workforce, basically.
Okay. Andrew, if I could maybe bring you back in. I mean, I know your investing career has focused a little more on the E in ESG and climate tech. So feel free to interpret this question as you see fit. But you're looking at the potential investments you could be making at the moment. What sectors do you think are delivering or capable of delivering the greatest social impact?
So as I sort of alluded to earlier, obviously the companies we invest in, although they're sort of addressing sort of climate change or resource scarcity, they are also often addressing social issues as well. So for example, sort of food and agri-tech, obviously, big concern, particularly highlighted at the moment in terms of sort of the supply chain shortages. We hear all kinds of things, sort of some of the problems that are going to occur in Africa. So companies that are coming up with either sort of looking at sort of even sort of the local side of things in terms of sort of wonky veg type of businesses to sort of call, but also we've got investment in a company called Dry Grow, which is using an alternative way of generating animal feed that is basically it will cut the cost of animal feed in sub-Saharan Africa, and then is no longer then reliant on sort of alternative use of grain to feed animals. So they're achieving we sort of look at that in the whole, because we see that those are the things that actually come back to it. Those are going to be the sustainable markets. That's the future of food. It is not the way we've always done it. And therefore, inherently they're more resilient, and inherently they can survive these kind of sort of shocks that we're seeing this year more intensively. So that's one area we definitely see coming through. Again, another very topical area, sort of talk about Eric's in terms of sort of fuel poverty. So companies that have been working with, to sort of improve the energy efficiency of houses, to improve the sort of, as well as cutting carbon, they're also taking people out of fuel poverty. And, long term, we can't rely on, we have to use less energy and those houses, how do they help achieve that? So those are two very areas where businesses are delivering social impact as we speak into two very pressing issues.
So it runs the gamut, really, doesn't it? Right from innovation to goods and services, which also have this positive impact that you talk about. Paul, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about Civitas. I mean, you guys are one of the better known social impact investors, given your listing in the UK. It's fair to say there's been a few doubts among some investors and the regulator of your tenant base in the last year about the sustainability of your model. What's your response to the criticism from that regulator that some of the leases in your portfolio are uneconomic for your counterparties? What's your response to that?
Well, obviously I come from the social housing sector. We work very closely with the regulator. The actual regulatory view was around the sustainability of the housing associations themselves, in the sense that they are revenue-based organisations, not asset-only organisations. And the reason that they're not asset-only is because they're utilising leases to house very vulnerable people. I mean, what I would say is that we haven't got much time left, and we're happy to talk about it at length, but we've had a rent roll of over £150 million in the last 6 years. That's been collected effectively. There's a return to investors that's very modest. It houses, the REIT itself houses nearly 5,000 people, and these are working age people who need accommodation for life. So there's no reason why a long lease shouldn't work. But obviously, it's absolutely in our interest that every single lease does work. And if there was ever a problem with any particular property or lease, then we would sort it out. The only problems there truly can be are poor quality of property, over-rented, or indeed poor care packages. And obviously, as you would expect, we're absolutely all over all of those matters.
On the, given the enormous demand out there you're talking about, is there an opportunity to raise fresh equity in your sector, or you see over the next year to expand?
I mean, a lot of the equity that's coming in is from different parts of investors. I mean, some of the very mainstream insurance companies are investing in this as well. There's a lot of private wealth, which actually was going in 25 years ago into this sector. And indeed, there are other listed vehicles. We were the first, but there are other ones. So there's plenty of space. As you rightly say, the demand is enormous. What you must do is get it right. It has to be very high quality in the right place. with the right partners, commissioned by a local authority at the right level of rent. Because if it isn't those things, then it is compromising the needs of the most vulnerable people in society. So, that's why it's absolutely proper that it's done right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just very, very final question here. Susanna, I just want to bring you back. I mean, we just talked a little bit there with Paul about opportunities for primary capital investing. I mean, sometimes it confuses me a little bit when we talk about ESG or, the impact the investors can have. It's often a case of shuffling around pieces of paper in the secondary market. Their own ability to put money into projects which are going to have an impact is almost limited to the nature of that beast. Are there the sort of projects out there which investors can inject fresh equity or capital into you're seeing? And if so, which asset classes are doing that best?
I would actually bring this up if you hadn't touched. I think there's a great potential out there. And in the fixed income side, we do see the market of social bonds growing quite significantly. It was potential. It has increased, especially due to the COVID crisis. It was when we had the most issuances of social bonds. Traditional, the market has been populated by green bonds, but we saw this shift during the crisis, during the pandemic crisis. It's still not over because we are still facing another crisis now during the war, during this war times. So I can see that the market there is still potential to grow in terms of how many entities are issuing bonds, social bonds in particular. And this is a very strong, a very powerful instrument on the fixed income side, because the capital that is raised goes to specific projects. And if an entity issues a social bond, it will go definitely to social related projects. And there is a very precise accountability to all the process. So the investor can actually measure, can see the impact and the result of the money that goes into those projects, because there is an annual report that provides accountability to all the projects that have been supported by the bond.
Yeah, good stuff. I suppose a bit more clarity from the yield curve will help us as well there, potentially with future issuance. Okay, I've probably overrun there, so that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But just to remind you, this session is going to be on demand for 30 days on the webpage you're currently watching this on. So feel free to share it with your network, friends and family if you found it useful. All that leads me to say is thanks once again to my panelists, Paul, Andrew and Susanna, for your great insight today. And other than that, thank you to everyone for watching.